Good day. Today is Friday, 20th June 2025, and yesterday, if you assume that the information provided by the White House is correct, the war between the United States and Iran, which seemed about to start, has allegedly been postponed. To be precise, the White House spokesman said that President Trump was minded to give Iran one last chance to come to a deal, and that he would make a decision whether to start the conflict against Iran or not at some point, some undetermined point, over the course of the next 2 weeks. Now, it's widely assumed by many people that this means that we should not expect a US attack on Iran at any point within the next 2 weeks. I wish I could share that confidence, but straightforwardly and very simply, I don't. After all, it's only a week since we were hearing all those stories about how the United States and Israel cunningly used the cover of negotiations to prepare their attack on Iran. I've expressed my own deep skepticism about the truth of some of those claims. After all, as I repeatedly point out, reports about the pending unilateral, quotation marks, Israeli attack on Iran was all over the media and seemed to be completely unanchored to the progress or otherwise of the negotiations. But anyway, we've had this narrative that there was a huge degree of duplicity, that there was a major plot to fool the Iranians, to let the Ukrainians, to persuade the Ukrainians to let their guards slip, using the negotiations which were supposed to take place on the 15th of June, 5 days ago in other words, as a ruse in order to facilitate the Israeli strike on Iran. As I said, I've expressed my own deep skepticism about the truth of that story. But never mind, the Americans have run with it, the Israelis have run with it, the Iranians are also running with it as well. They're actually saying, despite all those news reports that were circulating across the media about the imminent Israeli strike on Iran, that they were actually fooled. To me, that looks like an alibi to try to explain away the chaos and disorganization that we saw in Iran on the first day of the attack on Thursday and Friday of last week. But never mind, everybody talks about this clever ruse. So given that everybody's talking about a clever ruse that supposedly took place last week, how can we have any confidence that this announcement that President Trump has decided to postpone the attack on Iran for the time being, and perhaps for 2 weeks, has any reality behind it? Might it not, in fact, be a ruse? There is an alternative theory which appears to originate in an article written by the American investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, that the attack is actually going to come this weekend, and that what Donald Trump really wants to do is to postpone speculation of an attack until after close of business in the US financial markets later today. So supposedly the attack will then take place after the markets have closed, and by the time the markets reopen on Monday, well, it will all have been done and any damage in the markets will have been avoided. I don't myself think that that is how the markets will react, but never mind, it could be that that is the game plan, in which case, as I said, all this talk about postponing the attack for 2 weeks or deciding whether or not to attack within the next 2 weeks is, or could quite plausibly be just a ruse. Of course, if it is, then the already tattered credibility of the US government will be damaged even further. People will be even more skeptical in believing or trusting anything that it in fact says. There are some reasons, and I can just say this, the thinking, however, that the president has indeed made that decision, that he's looked at the possibility of an attack on Iran by the United States and has come to realize that this would be a bad idea, that it might not play out well for him. Firstly, at the narrow political level, the opinion polls are showing clear majority opposition within the United States against the United States supporting a strike against Iran or involving itself in the war. As I discussed in a program I did about 2 days ago, the Federalist, the intellectual website, if you like, of the MAGA movement, has now published an article which straightforwardly says that the United States should not be involved in the war, and making pointed comparisons between the claims that are being made today about Iran's nuclear program with the claims that were being made prior to the attack on Iraq in 2003. So there is, as I've discussed in many places, a significant political risk and potential political cost, catastrophic political cost, quite plausibly, if the United States were indeed to join the war against Iraq. Then it has to be said that there is now what looks to be increasing opposition to this attack from America's own allies. The Europeans are today meeting with the Iranian Foreign Minister, Mr. Araghchi, in Geneva, and they are signaling to the United States that they do not want to see a conflict between the United States and Iran. Emmanuel Macron has been perhaps the most outspoken about this. He's also spoken out against any attempt at regime change in Iran. He has made perfectly valid points about the threat of chaos in the Middle East if regime change were to happen and there were to be a disintegration of state authority in Iran, a country of 92 million, encompassing a huge territory north of the Persian Gulf and in Central Asia. So Macron has been speaking out against this. Interestingly, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, has also apparently been telling Donald Trump not to do this. Now, in Starmer's case, I suspect that this reflects the steady weakening of Starmer's own domestic political position. The Labour Party depends very heavily in Britain, increasingly heavily, in fact, on the support of Muslim voters. Those voters would be expected to be extremely unhappy were the United States to attack a Muslim country, and that probably would be a major complicating factor politically for Keir Starmer. And if he were to be seen publicly to support what President Trump appears to be, or appeared to be, on the brink of doing, which is to say attacking Iran, then it is very easy to see how he might face challenges from within his own parliamentary party. And to say it straightforwardly, I don't think he's in a strong political position at the moment to handle challenges of that kind. He also, that's to say Keir Starmer, also has the further complication that Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, Britain's senior law officer, is apparently advising that an attack upon Iran at this time would be illegal. He's absolutely right. I have described this already. The IAEA and the American intelligence community have both said that Iran is not currently working to acquire a nuclear weapon. The nuclear facilities in Iran are peaceful. You might have a major question mark, as by the way I do, about Iran's nuclear enrichment program, enriching uranium up to a level of 60%. I question whether that was wise and was an intelligent negotiating strategy. I know a lot of people take a different view from me about this. But anyway, regardless of that, enriching uranium up to 60%, but not moving beyond that to acquire a nuclear weapon, does not violate, as I understand it. In fact, I've never heard it suggested that it does violate the provisions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which Iran remains a signatory and of which it has been almost entirely observant. So attacks on nuclear facilities, which are currently peaceful nuclear facilities, would certainly be contrary to international law, to the relevant conventions, which apparently date back to the early 1950s. And beyond that, Iran, prior to the attack which Israel launched on Thursday the 12th and Friday the 13th, was a country at peace. It was not attacking any other country. It had, in fact, agreed various treaty provisions with several countries. It had recently joined the BRICS. It had developed commercial and trading links with the United States, and it had come to all kinds of ceasefire agreements with Israel, which it appeared to be observing. So, from every conceivable point of view, from every perspective of international law, whether you believe in the right of preemptive self-defense or not, an attack on Iran, one conducted without the consent or approval of the UN Security Council, would certainly be a violation of international law. And as Vladimir Putin never ceases to point out, it would be an act of aggression. So Lord Hermer's advice is correct. It is very similar to the advice that the Blair government received on the eve of the 2003 Iraq war. The Blair government disregarded that advice. It went against popular feeling in Britain, which opposed that war. As I said previously, I don't think Keir Starmer is in a position to resist the kind of opposition in Britain that Blair was able to in 2002, 2003. But it's important to remember that Blair himself paid a heavy political cost in the end and ceased to be Prime Minister 3 years after the start of the war, because his credibility and authority in Britain after the start of the war essentially collapsed. So, Keir Starmer also opposing the war. Importantly, over the last couple of hours, a government which has been a consistent supporter of the United States, of Donald Trump specifically, and, by the way, perhaps Israel's most fervent friend in Europe, the government of Hungary, has now come out and is starting to speak out against some of the moves that have been contemplated. It's been suggested that the purpose of the Israeli attacks on Iran are regime change. The Israelis have been openly talking now about assassinating the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. Donald Trump has published threats against doing so. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, and Peter Szijjártó, Hungary's foreign minister, have now come out and made statements opposing such steps, talking strongly about their opposition to any regime change attempt in Iran, saying that that would be a fatal and disastrous mistake with huge uncertain consequences for the Middle East. I suspect that Donald Trump, to say it straightforwardly, pays a lot more attention to what people like Orban and Seattle are saying, as opposed to what Macron and Starmer are saying, and I don't think he has much time for the last two. So, in Europe there is opposition. Around the world there is opposition. There is an article in the Financial Times which says that the Gulf states, strong allies of the United States, personal friends of Donald Trump, they too would oppose any attempt at regime change in Iran, any direct attempts to strike at the supreme leader. They are worried about the effect of on the stability of their region and ultimately of their own states and societies if the region were to plunge into chaos and into all-out war. And of course, China and Russia, as I've discussed in many programs, have also made very clear their strong opposition to regime change as well. And the Russian government yesterday forwarded to the United States apparently a strong démarche warning the United States against seeking regime change in Iran. And I've no doubt that this is a follow-up to the warnings that President Putin himself gave when he spoke to Donald Trump 2 or 3 days ago. Incidentally, on that topic, President Trump has given the impression that he has had a further telephone conversation with President Putin since that earlier telephone conversation, which I have discussed in a number of programs. The Russians say that this is not so, that Trump, when he talked in a way that suggested that there might have been another telephone conversation between himself and Putin, was speaking metaphorically rather than literally. That's actually what the Russians have said. Anyway, so there is a strong international opposition to this, but in my experience that hardly ever is enough by itself to deter the United States from any course that it has decided upon. The political reaction within the United States is, of course, another matter, but I suspect that there are also other factors at play. There was an interesting article in the London Times which spoke about how President Trump's inner circle is trying to back out of a war with Iran. For all the president's hostile rhetoric, his advisors are increasingly wary of threats to American troops, and Steve Witkoff is in constant talks with Iran. And the article then continues. President Trump is looking for an exit ramp from US military involvement in Iran as concern grows amongst his advisors about Iran's ability to strike back at bases in the region and kill American troops, the Times understands. Iran's penetration of Israeli defenses to hit Tel Aviv with hypersonic missiles on Wednesday has influenced calculations about the US directly joining the war by targeting Iran's nuclear facilities with the US's bunker-busting bombs. Missiles used by Iran are among the fastest ever used in warfare at up to 5 times the speed of sound and can maneuver mid-flight, enabling them to evade Israel's Arrow defenses. And the article then goes on to say that Steve Witkoff is in near daily phone contact with Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, who is refusing to join further nuclear talks whilst his country is under attack from Israel. And we go on to read in this article, Arakshi has raised another stumbling block, telling Witkoff that Iran wants a third party at the negotiating table and suggesting this could be China. Iran does not trust the nations presenting themselves as interlocutors for talks, the United States, Britain and Germany, because of their hostile language about the regime in Iran. The Iranians claim they have the upper hand in a straight exchange of missiles with Iran, but fear US involvement. They have warned Witkoff they have the capability to take out every American base in the region, saying that if they can hit Israel, they can hit Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar with overwhelming force, according to a source close to the US team. This has led Trump to give Witkoff more time to seek meaningful negotiations on Iran's nuclear capabilities, complicated by Iran's refusal to abandon its civil nuclear program. Well, that's the Times, the London Times. I don't know how good or strong its sources are. I think that worries about possible Iranian attacks on American bases in the Middle East are probably real. There's been pictures which show some American bases, like Ubaid in Qatar, have been essentially abandoned, that the United States has pulled all of its aircraft out of that base, obviously because it fears that Iran might target the base and destroy any American aircraft that are there. There's no word, by the way, as to where those aircraft have gone, and I expect that this is highly classified information, though of course China and Russia will be keeping track of what is happening and will almost certainly be advising Iran. So Iran probably does know where the aircraft are, because the Chinese and the Russians will be telling it, but we, that is to say myself and you, my viewers, we, of course, are not provided with that information. It does sometimes seem to me that in the world of intelligence and classified briefings and all of that, one gets almost a sense sometimes that there is one single gigantic intelligence community that, for all its divisions, is united in one thing, which is to keep the truth from us, even as they all know it between them. But anyway, let's move on. So there is that concern. And apparently there are also concerns about the effectiveness of the bunker busting bombs. And I suspect that this might be an even more important factor than worries about Iranian missile attacks on bases. If there is an attack on Fordow, and even if the attack on Fordow, as I speculated yesterday, is not the main purpose of the strike, the main purpose of the strike being the elimination of the political leadership of Iran and the attempt to create a political crisis in Iran leading to regime change in that country. I cannot see how, after all the rhetoric that there has been, the United States can avoid an attack on Fordow. But, let us assume that there is an attack on Fordow, which seems likely. Apparently, there are now increasing doubts by many people that the bunker busting bombs would be sufficient to destroy the Fordow facility. I've been reading all sorts of articles by all kinds of people. The consensus amongst them is that probably the bombs, if used correctly, would be able to damage and perhaps even destroy Fordow. But since there is uncertainty about the soil and rock composition of the earth in the area, and also about the concrete levels, the level and strength of the concrete used for the facility. Nobody seems to be completely sure. And it seems that the president himself, Donald Trump, has noticed this, and understandably, that has him worried, in the sense that if an attack on Fordow is made and it does fail, then that will be a political disaster for him and for the United States. This would be an operation that would have to succeed. There's some reports which say that in order to be sure of success, the United States would have to occupy the Fordow site itself with troops, and of course that is something that the United States is probably unable to do, given that the ideas of sending US troops to invade Iran itself, well, nobody's talking about them. And from what I can understand, that idea is in effect completely ruled out. Now, here I have to say something which I find absolutely astonishing and indeed horrifying, which is that there has been increasing amount of speculation in the US media that if the United States decides or concludes that its bunker-busting bombs cannot destroy the Fordow facility, then the United States might resort to tactical nuclear weapons to destroy the Fordow facility. Doing such a thing would be an absolutely appalling act. If nuclear weapons are used for the first time since the end of the Second World War, the first time nuclear weapons were used, the only time so far nuclear weapons have been used in war was during the Second World War in the August 1945 attacks on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If the United States, which carried out those earlier attacks, were to use nuclear weapons in an attack now, as I said, I mean, the consequences just don't bear thinking about. And I am not myself going to start speculating about them. All I will say is that we will live in a completely different geopolitical reality on the following day, and the pace of nuclear proliferation will accelerate unimaginably. That at the very least. There is one perhaps less important but nonetheless point that I'm going to make, and I've not seen anybody else make it, and I do think it's one that bears making, which is that, of course, ever since the autumn of 2022, there has been an unending narrative. It gets repeated constantly. It's trotted out time and time again that Vladimir Putin and the Russians in the autumn of 2022, as the situation in Kherson region was turning against them, contemplated using nuclear weapons. Putin himself has always and repeatedly categorically denied having ever entertained any such thought. But as I said, it is repeated endlessly. The Biden administration said it time and again. They claimed that they contacted the Chinese to discuss the question with the Chinese and to get the Chinese to tell the Russians not to do it. By the way, the Chinese have never confirmed that or discussed it in any way. So what the Chinese actually think about that whole story, well, who knows? But anyway, that narrative, that story, that fable, because I believe it is a fable, has never died. For the record, there may have been some stray comments made by General Surovikin, which might have been caught in a radio intercept. But I personally believe that the real origin of the story was the fact that around that time, the Russians became concerned that Ukraine was contemplating a dirty bomb operation, an operation in which a conventional nuclear bomb was enriched, if you like, with nuclear material and was exploded in some location, creating nuclear contamination. And the Russians said that they were worried about that, and the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu contacted the Americans to express his concerns. I remember how all of this happened in the autumn of 2022, and I seem to remember that the Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, did the same. He telephoned and discussed it all with General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I think that the Americans put two and two together and made 10 and said that the Russians were constructing a cover story for themselves in order to justify their own use of nuclear weapons, which I don't believe was in any respect the case. But anyway, that story has spread. It's been peddled incessantly. People have cited it as evidence of the recklessness bordering on insanity of the Russian leader, President Putin. And here we have, even as that story about the Russians contemplating the use of nuclear weapons, even as that story, I suspect, has every prospect of being revived at some point, here we now have, right across the American media, people coolly, calmly debating the possibility, quite openly, of the United States using nuclear weapons against Iran. And we have reports supposedly going back to sources within the Trump administration saying that that idea has not been ruled out. So, a story about the Russians using nuclear weapons, which has no factual basis and which has been categorically denied by the Russians many times. That is enough to prove that Vladimir Putin is a crazy man capable of doing monstrous things and starting World War III. An American story about the United States considering the use of nuclear weapons against Iran. A story, by the way, which the US government has not so far denied. Well, that of course, nobody takes, that doesn't raise any of the same concerns. We can all talk about it and write articles discussing whether or not it would work and whether it would be a good idea, but it doesn't provoke any of the sort of concerns that have been expressed when the Russians are supposed to have thought about it. Well, I mean, there's nothing new here. I mean, the United States has consistently held itself to a completely different standard from everyone else. That, after all, was what that book by Chomsky and Herman, Manufacturing Consent, ultimately was all about. But here we have another perfect example of this in operation. Think about it next time you go and read articles, as you probably will, over the next couple of days, speculating about American nuclear strikes on Fordor. Just saying. Anyway, there it is. So I'm not going to spend more time on this. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, by the way, has said that these reports about the Americans using nuclear weapons in Iran are highly speculative to the point of being just rumors. And the Russians clearly don't expect it to happen. and for the record, nor do I. I think that people within the US government and the US military are far too alive to the consequences of doing such a terrible thing, the negative consequences for the United States, that I don't think in the end, whoever is spreading these stories, I don't think anybody in the US government is going to do it. Of course, if the war drags on, if things really do start to go very badly for Israel, then it might be different. But I don't think we're at anything close to that point yet, just to say. So anyway, I think the president is concerned about that, and I think that he is concerned about the possible failure of a strike on Fordo. And, well, there could be other speculations as well. The religious leader of the Shia community, not just in Iraq, but I believe around the world, he is the most senior Shia cleric, Ayatollah al-Sistani, who is based in Iraq. He apparently has also made absolutely clear the extremely negative reaction of the Shia community around the world in the event that Ayatollah Khamenei, who is after all a Shia cleric, were attacked and killed by the United States. So I think perhaps, especially given worries about the safety of Americans in the Middle East, that is also weighing on the administration. And anyway, there are probably lots of different reasons and concerns that are growing about an American attack on the Middle East. But we can discuss all of this. It's important to say again that the United States has gone very, very far already in signaling that it is interested in an attack or is prepared to conduct an attack. We've had deployments of massive forces. We've had extraordinary rhetoric coming out of the United States. We have had extraordinary rhetoric coming from the pen of the president as he writes extraordinarily unwise and reckless comments on Truth Social. We have even more dangerous rhetoric from the Israeli government, which continues to escalate its rhetoric every day against Iran. And, of course, we have the fact, and it is an indisputable fact, of an attack on Iran at a time when the country was at peace and was peacefully negotiating with the United States about the future of its nuclear program. So, given those realities, anybody who assumes that these arguments against an attack on Iran, however compelling they might appear to anybody who retains any sense of objective reality, anybody who assumes that these arguments will ultimately weigh the decision in favor of non-intervention, I think is being complacent and is not taking into account both the actual realities of the conflict which are raging at the moment and our experience of what has happened when huge forces like this and rhetoric of this kind and military action all happen in the Middle East. My own instinct is that in spite of everything, the probability is that some kind of an attack on Iran is likely at some point within the next 2 weeks, maybe within the next few hours or days, though I pray and hope that I am wrong. Now, having said all of this, we are starting to get the sense that the other side, if you like, not just the Iranians, are beginning to take countermeasures. Yesterday, I spoke about the conversation between President Putin of Russia and President Xi of China, and the way in which these two leaders appeared to be coordinating with each other. We've now have the usual very long readout from the Chinese side. Most of it, including a so-called four-point plan that Xi Jinping outlined over the course of this conversation, which, as is often the way with Chinese plans, seem to me more a catalogue of aspirations and prohibitions. Don't attack civilians, for example, which absolutely one would like to see honoured, but it doesn't seem to me to be a well-defined plan to end this conflict. Anyway, most of the Chinese readout is about that, but it does contain these rather important words. Vladimir Putin briefed President Xi on Russia's views on the current situation in the Middle East, saying that Israel's attack on Iran's nuclear facilities is extremely dangerous and that the escalation of the conflict is not in the interest of any party. The Iranian nuclear issue should be resolved through dialogue and negotiation. Both parties to the conflict should ensure the safety of third country nationals. As the situation is still evolving rapidly, Russia is willing to maintain close communication with China and make active efforts to cool down the situation so as to safeguard regional peace and stability. Now that chimes with the Russian readout. There is no word in the Chinese readout of China supporting Russia's efforts to act as a mediator in the conflict, and that could be because, going back to what Arrakchi is supposed to be saying, that he wants China to be involved as the mediator instead. It could be that the Chinese had received a request to that effect from Iran and were themselves considering it, and might be proposing to put themselves forward as mediators instead, possibly. But anyway, in all other respects, this readout, this Chinese readout, corresponds with the Russian readout. The Russians and the Chinese are coordinating, and they're starting to take measures. And some of these measures are becoming visible. Two Chinese intelligence gathering ships, spy ships if you like, are now apparently in the area, and I've seen photographs of one of them, and we're talking about a large and sophisticated looking ship with all sorts of radars and things of that kind. They are in the area. Apparently these ships have the ability to keep track of the movement of aircraft and perhaps some missiles. And, well, if you think that the Chinese aren't sharing at least some of this intelligence that they're obtaining from these ships and from the many other intelligence gathering systems that they have at their disposal, if you think that they're not sharing at least some of this information with Iran, which is after all a BRICS state, then I have a bridge to sell you. I am sure that the Chinese are doing that very thing. Now, according to Alistair Crook, I believe it is Alistair Crook, or it could be Larry Johnson at Sonar 21. The Russians have also sent a senior military official to Iran. It is in fact Larry Johnson. A senior Russian defense official arrived in Tehran earlier this week and met with Pezeshkian and his Iranian military counterparts. We're not told who this person was, or what he was doing there, or what proposals, if any, he had to make, but presumably the Russians are also involved in some way in trying to perhaps assess the situation on the ground in Iran, get a sense of what the Iranian leadership is up to and how strong their position is and how firm their position is. And perhaps this military official was also there to report back to Moscow on what might be needed for Iran to stabilize the situation and reduce the risk of Israeli air attacks to itself. So the Chinese are making a visible presence. We don't need to speculate about mysterious flights from China and what they might be about. The presence of these two Chinese ships, PLA 815A and PLA 855, those look to me, by the way, to be American designations for these two ships rather than Chinese ones. Anyway, the presence of these two ships is indisputable. I don't know whether there is the same certainty about the visit of the Russian military official, but I would be extremely surprised if things like that were not happening. And it does look as if the Chinese and the Russians, in taking all of these steps, are now working together. And I would guess that both behind the scenes and perhaps before long publicly, they could start taking joint diplomatic initiatives to bring the fighting to a stop. And of course, they could also be giving privately various warnings to the Israelis and to the Americans that unless the fighting does stop, China and Russia will start to take action to support Iran and in order to bring the fighting to a stop. Now, here I would like to make one point absolutely clear. I have had a email from somebody who has speculated about Russia and China either deploying, China and or Russia either deploying troops to Iran with nuclear weapons or assisting Iran with its nuclear weapons program. I can say absolutely categorically that that isn't going to happen. Russia does not want to see Iran acquire nuclear weapons. They've made that perfectly clear. There are compelling reasons why Russia would not want to see Iran acquire nuclear weapons. I've discussed them in many programs. Russian and Chinese military assistance, if that's what it comes to Iran will fall well short of that possibility. Now, going back to Larry Johnson and his blog, and by the way, I should say, anybody who wants to get a sense of a lot of what's going on in this conflict should definitely go to Larry Johnson's blog, Sonar 21. Anyway, he has also provided some rather interesting further information, which apparently originates with Alistair Crook, who of course has his sources within Iran. And I'll just read the relevant words from Larry Johnson's latest article. Vladimir Putin made some news on Wednesday while speaking to a group of foreign officials in Moscow. This is the news agencies. When he explained that Russia had offered to sign a defense pact with Iran, but Iran declined to do so. There is no question about this. It is there in the Russian readout. It is in conformity with what I myself had been told some time before when I was in St. Petersburg. I discussed it in a live stream we did on the Duran with Brian Beletic. Over the course of that live stream, I mentioned that I had been told while I was in Russia that the Russians had found Iran a difficult country to help. That's my words, by the way, not the words of the Russian interlocutor. I was not told that Iran had declined to agree to a defense pact as part of the recent partnership treaty. I want to make that absolutely clear. But it is consistent with what I was told generally about Iran. Anyway, then Larry Johnson goes on to say this. According to Alistair Crook, and as I said, I know no one in the West better informed about Iran and about the thinking and discussions that take place within the Iranian government than Alistair Crook. If you read articles in Reuters or in the Daily Telegraph, which can be attributed to Iranian officials, those articles do appear from time to time, I would strongly advise you to ignore them. They're almost certainly misdirection. I do not believe that Iranian officials brief Reuters or the Daily Telegraph, but I have no doubt at all that they do have genuine and sincere conversations with Alistair Crook, just to say, who is somebody whom the Iranians know well and whom they trust. According to Alistair Crook, President Pezeshkian still held out hopes for improved relations with the West and believed that signing such an agreement, in other words, a defense pact with Russia, would antagonize Washington. He now realizes he was foolishly naive. That basically puts the decision not to go ahead with the security pact, the defense pact, that Putin was talking about, the blame for it, if you will, on Pezeshkian. I'm afraid I completely believe that. I have no doubt that is true. Pezeshkian, when he was elected president, seemed to me to have an extraordinary belief, one which, however, it must be said, continues to be shared by many, many people in Iran, that if Iran made earnest attempts to try to persuade the United States and Israel of its peaceful intentions, then relations between Iran and the United States could be normalized. And furthermore, a belief that better relations with the United States was far more important for Iran than development of relations with its BRICS neighbors. I've discussed this in many places. I think that Pezeshkian's views on this strongly reflect a strong current of feeling amongst a section of Iranian society which still hankers for good relations between Iran and the West. The former president, Ebrahim Raisi, had no such illusions and appears to have decided and made the political decision that Iran should seek a closer engagement instead with the Eurasian powers. His death, supposedly in an accident, though I'm having significant doubts about this now, led eventually to the arrival of Pezeshkian. I get the sense that Pezeshkian, in his own way, is a sincere man, but I think he is politically far out of his depth. I think he has failed entirely to gauge the realities of American and Israeli attitudes to Iran. And I think that has led him into a huge error. And where a defense pact with Russia was there for the taking, apparently he chose not to take it because he thought that would upset the United States. Well, there it is. He apparently now realizes that he was foolishly naive. I suppose one should feel, if you're Iranian, grateful for that, though I suspect some Iranians might feel that it would have been better if he had not been naive in that way in the first place. Larry Johnson then goes on to say that Putin made it clear that Russia is prepared to help Iran defend itself by providing air defense systems. I think that is true. I think that perhaps rather slightly overstates Putin's exact words, but I think the meaning is clear enough, and it is in accord with what Larry Johnson says. And then Larry Johnson says this, and I have to say I accept this too. I mistakenly believe that Russia provided some S-400 systems to Iran last October, but Putin said that that was not the case. I thought the same. There were lots of reports of flights of Russian aircraft to Iran, and there were lots of rumors at the time that the Russians had supplied Iran with an S-400 system. It turns out that this was not the case, and I thought at the time that it probably was. Larry Johnson thought at the time that it probably was. I think he says that he was wrong, and I must say the same. Again, I suspect that if the Iranians at that time had asked the Russians for such a system, there's a chance, despite the fact that the Russians are engaged in conflict with Ukraine, that the Russians might have provided it, but it seems that they never did. And as Larry Johnson goes on to say, so far, according to Putin, Iran has made no request for additional assistance. So I wonder how long that will continue for, by the way, but that perhaps now brings me to the actual state of the war. Now, my comments yesterday provoked some strong reactions from people on both sides. I maintain them. I think that we're now in what might be described as a somewhat desultory stalemate. Israel continues to conduct raids against Iran. It has attacked certain industrial facilities in northern Tehran, and it also attacked yesterday the Arak nuclear reactor that Iran has been building for at least the last 15 years. It doesn't seem to be making a huge amount of progress, and done some damage to this reactor. The reactor itself is not yet in operation. Iraq is an interesting symbol of Iran's nuclear ambitions, because apparently it was first talked about in Iran way back in the 1990s. The Iranians finally got round to working on it around 2010, but it has never been completed. It was apparently intended to replace the research reactor, the Tehran research reactor, that was supplied to Iran by the United States in the 1960s. And the important fact about the Arak reactor is that it is apparently designed to work without using enriched uranium. I don't quite understand how that works, but then I'm not a person who understands much about nuclear technology. The thing to say about the Arak reactor is that if it ever were to be put into operation, which it has never been, it could conceivably, apparently, provide Iran with plutonium material, which would be another route towards obtaining a nuclear device. But there is no evidence that the Iranians have ever planned to use Arak in that way. And just to say again, the reactor has never been finished and never gone into operation. So the Israelis attacked this reactor, and I can't help but think that their doing so is, in effect, an admission that they can't do significant damage to the actual nuclear enrichment facilities. Fordo, but also, to a certain extent at least, Natanz and Esfahan. So anyway, there we go. So attacks by Israel against Iran, and Iran has conducted its own attacks against Israel, and it has launched missiles against Israel, and again some of these missiles have managed to hit targets in Israel. Again, there is a refusal to acknowledge that Iranian missiles do hit their designated targets in Israel. The Iranians have continued their destruction of the buildings of the Weizmann Institute, and they've also apparently attacked other military locations in Israel. And there are reports, which I'm sure are true, that the attack on the hospital that was being complained about yesterday was not an attack by Iran on the hospital at all. It was an attack on a neighboring military facility, and the fact that the facility was close to the hospital is something that one should be critical of the Israelis for, or at least that is what people are saying. Now, here again, I'm going to say that I agree with the comment that Larry Johnson has made on Sonar 21, which is that the big story of these attacks, both by Israel against Iran and by Iran against Israel, is that the air defense systems of both sides have fallen short. The Iranian air defense system appears to me fragmented and disorganized. Maybe it has had some effect in deterring Israel from operating aircraft over Iranian airspace, though the Israelis, of course, denied that. But it has failed to protect successfully key Iranian targets from key Iranian targets from Israeli strikes. As for the Israeli system, as I said, it has been talked up massively over the last 10 or so years, but it is clearly not achieving what many of us were told it would achieve. Now, there is perhaps a vivid film which illustrates this point. The Iranians apparently operated, perhaps by way of warning, one particular missile, Fateh 2 missile. This is said to have a hypersonic capability, possibly. Anyway, the picture shows Israeli air defense missiles being launched in some number to try to shoot down this missile, this Fateh 2, incoming Fateh 2 missile, into the night sky. You can see the missiles being launched, the Israeli missiles, the air defense missiles being launched. And then you suddenly see, streaking across the sky at extraordinary speed, entirely unaffected by all of these Israeli missiles, which it leaves trailing in its wake, is the incoming Fateh 2 missile. And then you see it impact, and you see an explosion. What exactly the Fateh 2 missile hit, whether it hit its target, I'm not even going to try and speculate. But the whole film illustrates a number of things. Firstly, that the Israeli air defense system is not able to shoot down Iranian hypersonic missiles like the Fateh 2. And secondly, that in their attempt to shoot down the Fateh 2, the Israelis had to use, or tried to use, launched large numbers of air defense missiles that are in short supply, to no visible effect. So I think that those American concerns that the Times was talking about, that the Iranians have demonstrated a capability to strike at targets in Israel with their hypersonic missiles, and that this means that the Iranians could also strike American targets across the Middle East. Well, the film, the facts, basically show that that is true. Now, that is the reality. It is also apparently the reality that Israel is indeed running short of air defense missiles. There are reports, again, I suspect they originate with Larry Johnson, that at least I've read them. I've read it. I've learnt about it from Larry Johnson. But apparently there are reports that some people within the US intelligence and defense community believe that Iran is running short of missiles. Perhaps that is true. The Iranians claim otherwise. I think it would be complacent to suppose that it is true, given the fact that the Iranian missiles are indeed getting through. Now, I'm going to finish here by saying one last thing, which is apparently, or at least there are reports, that the CIA director, John Radcliffe, is indeed coming out and is telling Trump that he thinks that there is some truth to the Israeli claims that the Iranians were indeed moving forward to acquire a nuclear weapons capability. Now, that directly and flatly contradicts what the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, said was the consensus opinion of the US intelligence community just a few weeks ago in March. I cannot believe that the CIA has obtained any new information since that assessment that was made in March, which the CIA was backing at that time. I understand that Tulsi Gabbard is sticking with her March 2025 assessment. It seems to me that what we're starting to see is that intelligence coming from the CIA in this case is being politicized again to suit some people's agendas, exactly as happened in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War. Anyway, there we go. This is where I finish my program today, my discussion of the Iranian situation today. The Iranians continue publicly to take a very, very hard line. They're saying that they're not prepared to negotiate with the United States until the attacks on Iran cease. That puts President Trump in a very difficult position. We will see what the various armies of mediators, the Chinese and the Russians, the Europeans, the Arab states, what they all manage to do, and whether somehow some off-ramp will be found to enable the United States, the president, to back off. If that is what he genuinely wants to do, I'm far from confident, as I made clear in this program, that he is, and to achieve that cessation of missile strikes and perhaps a resumption of negotiations over the course of the next couple of days or weeks. I'm not convinced, as I said, that there is actually an opening for negotiations, despite what the White House spokesman said yesterday, but we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, I'm going to now turn to the topic once more of the conflict in Ukraine. And again, since I have had to devote most of this program to the Iran-Israel conflict, I'm not going to be able to give a huge amount of time to this topic. But suffice to say that the Russian advances continue right across the front lines. And about 2 days ago, the chief of general staff of the Russian armed forces, the most senior military officer, in other words, in Russia, General Gerasimov, who is also the overall commander of the forces that are conducting the special military operation. Anyway, Gerasimov visited the headquarters of Group of Forces Center, which is the force that is currently besieging Pakrovsk and whose forces are moving into Dnipropetrovsk region. And this is an interesting visit. Gerasimov conducts regular visits to military headquarters. But it does make me wonder whether perhaps the battle for Pakrovsk and the push towards the Dnieper are indeed the Russian priorities for the next few weeks. Anyway, in the meantime, I've received some really rather very interesting news about the overall situation of the Ukrainian armed forces. I spoke yesterday about the fact that Putin says that the Ukrainian military is down to 47% strength, that hardly any brigades are up to strength any longer in Ukraine. There has been an article in the German media, I believe it was Die Welt, which said the same thing, that the Ukrainian army is now desperately short of men, and that large areas of the front lines are being left effectively undefended, and that the Russians are pushing forward at the rate of about 14 kilometers a day, which, if true, by the way, would be an extremely fast advance, and that the situation for Ukraine is becoming desperate. Now, I received an email today from someone who I consider to be an exceptionally reliable source on this matter. And he said that in any 1 month, Ukraine is only able to receive a third of the gun barrels it needs in order to keep its artillery operating. It manages to get by using all sorts of cobbled together adaptations of old gun barrels. I'm not going to describe this because probably if I do, I will be giving too much away about the source. But anyway, the situation with gun barrels is problematic. That Ukraine is no longer receiving artillery ammunition or new gun barrels from the West, and that the West simply cannot produce enough gun barrels for Ukraine or artillery shells for Ukraine. That the Ukrainian military, as a result, has been forced to revert almost entirely to Soviet and Russian guns and ammunition, and that these have come from the former Syrian army stocks supplied to Ukraine by Turkey. I've discussed that in many previous programs, based on information, by the way, I've had mostly from this same source. And that ammunition is now starting to wear out, and that on top of all of Ukraine's other problems, it is now about to start suffering severe shortages of ammunition. This at a time when there are shortages of drones, including FPV drones. They're no longer as dominant in the skies over the battlefronts, the Ukrainian drones, as they used to be. Ukraine is now massively outnumbered by drones by the Russians. And, of course, the personnel shortages. And there was an article, again, I think it might have been from Die Welt, the same article from Die Welt, which talked about the situation with armoured vehicles. The major armoured vehicle, infantry fighting vehicle, that Ukraine has been relying upon, basically since 2023, has been the Bradley. And Ukraine received around 270 Bradleys in total from the United States, and as I remember, around 300 wheeled Striker infantry fighting vehicles. One no longer sees so much of the Striker anymore. I gather that most of them were destroyed in the Kursk operation, just to say. And the number of Bradleys, the total number of Bradleys that are left, numbers around 120. The remaining 150 are either destroyed or irreparably damaged or have become trophies for the Russians. And given the fact that we're talking about a 1,200 kilometer contact line, 120 Bradleys is nowhere near enough, and Bradley's infantry fighting vehicles are becoming so few that Ukraine is being forced to husband them. So there are equipment shortages which are starting to aggravate as well armoured vehicle shortages. It is a while, by the way, since I saw much evidence of Ukrainian tanks operating on the battlefronts. Apparently, most of the Abrams tanks have gone. Most of the Leopard 2s have gone. Ukraine does have a significant number of Leopard 1s, German-designed tanks, designed in the 1950s, put in production in the 1960s. By all accounts, a reliable and mobile tank, but one that really is outmatched by Russian tanks on the modern battlefield. And I'm not sure how many of those, anyway, Ukraine has left. So, shortages of drones, artillery, armoured vehicles. It's a very long time since I saw Soviet-era BMPs in the Ukrainian army, to say it simply. All of these pieces of equipment in increasingly short supply, even as the Russian army increases its combat power from 1 week to the other. Sooner or later, something is going to give, and probably a lot sooner than later. Just say, there's been another excellent article by Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vershinin, the person who wrote about industrial war. You can find it on Responsible Statecraft. Alex Vershinin is scathing about NATO's inability to learn anything from the way in which the war in Ukraine has been conducted, and the way in which the NATO militaries continue to cling to outdated and discredited ideas. The article's title is, incidentally, is How NATO Military Doctrine Failed Ukraine on the Battlefield. And he writes, and I absolutely agree with him about this, many Western military specialists do not appreciate the evolution in warfare. They believe that NATO's combined arms doctrine will break the Russian army. Unfortunately, emerging technology increased offensive firepower to the point where it defeats the protection of the attacker. And then he describes the way in which the West clings to this combined arms philosophy that it developed in the 1980s and seems very unwilling to learn from the fact that it failed in Ukraine. Most pundits assume that NATO failed to follow NATO doctrine. This is false. Ukraine tried NATO doctrine but abandoned it after it failed on the battlefield. It lacked a realistic concept for dealing with enemy minefields and fortifications. German instructors told incredulous Ukrainian soldiers, just drive around the minefields. The advice proved suicidal in the face of Russian sappers, whose reputation for massive, complex minefields reached back to World War II. And then he describes how there is a complete lack of realism, about much understanding of the way in which the Russians actually conduct war. And he speaks about observing the latest NATO exercise in the Baltic. French soldiers still clear trenches in large clustered groups using small arms. The only drone visible belongs to the reporter taking PR shots. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the Russian army uses drones at every level, from providing instant updates to assault troops to dropping grenades into strong points ahead of them. To preserve the lives of soldiers, grenades and large explosives are used to clear bunkers and corners instead of sending men. The French appear to do none of these tactics. The outcome of a clash between these two forces, French and the Russian, is not hard to predict. A similar picture appears to be in the air, where both sides are flying low, employing standoff munitions lobbed from safety provided by friendly air defense. Glide bombs are the weapons of choice for both Russians and Ukrainians, reducing exposure time and reducing aircraft losses to single digits. Of course, the Russians used glide bombs on a scale vastly greater than Ukraine. And Vershinin asks, will NATO adopt this practice? Unlikely. NATO military experts still talk about gaining air superiority and penetrating airspace beyond the front, flying into the very heart of Russian air defenses. Without massive US Air Force, Europeans would quickly run out of aircraft. I believe, as Vershinin clearly does, that whole idea is absolutely facile and absurd and would quickly result in the destruction of any air force, even the American, which tried to apply it. So there it is. It's a dismal picture. There's been many comments comparing the marching of the American troops in the recent parade in Washington with the marching of the Russian and Chinese troops at their respective parades. I have nothing to add to the many scathing comments people have made about that. It remains astonishing that Western leaders still cling to the belief that their military is qualitatively superior to the Russian, even when the realities show exactly the contrary. Anyway, none of this, of course, impacts on the realities of the situation on the ground in Ukraine, where the Russians continue to win the war at an ever faster, accelerating rate, without any sign that the Ukrainians can do anything to prevent it. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.